Why do people have kids? In the case of Henry VIII, it was pure vainglory in wanting to keep power for himself, and he was perfectly happy to commit mass murder to do so. In the case of the beggars on the streets of Kabul, while streams of expensive 4x4s go by, it's because it's easier to beg if you've got a newborn baby in your hand. After the Taliban takeover, they are selling a few of these children so they can afford to feed themselves and their other children, a production line in baby farming. How many kids do you want? Assuming equal numbers of girls and boys, even an heir and a spare requires a doubling of the world's population every generation. I'm sure I can't be the first to point out that if you'd have one problem if you lived forever, and that is that you'd never be able to have any kids. You'd forfeit the right to have kids. The world has only got a fixed size. There's no Australia, no America, no Moon or Mars to ship people to at the expense of the indigenous population. It follows as a matter of pure logic that the longer you live, the fewer children you can have. The longer you live, the longer you're occupying natural resources such as land and housing. A common question these days is, what can we do about global warming? Apart from commit suicide, there's a perfectly simple answer: have fewer kids. The world will be a wonderful place if only there weren't any humans in it. A famous television advertisement for soap powder featured a woman who said, "I find I have 3 children." There is apparently a tribe somewhere on the planet who still claim that there is no connection between sex and having kids. With contraception and cloning, this has become perfectly true. After the Neolithic Revolution, if you wanted a bigger family, all you had to do was to chop down a few more trees from what is now all that remaining a few fast disappearing acres of the Amazonian rainforest. It was nobody else's business how many kids you had. At least by the time the Vikings started raiding in search of more land for their ever-increasing populations, it had become everybody else's business. They slaughtered the Anglo-Saxon males and enslaved and worse the females, exactly as had done the Anglo-Saxons to what are called the native Britons before them. They were no more native than the Anglo-Saxons, but had migrated as the Beaker folk from what is now southern Russia and Ukraine, bringing their Bronze Age with them. These in turn had disposed of the Stone Age people, such that there is now virtually no trace of the latter's DNA in us. Just as the Roman invasion had been, the Norman invasion was a true colonisation. They didn't want to displace the population, but saw the land and its population as their property. They simply wanted to enslave them all as serfs, which remains the situation to this day. But they were slaves with rights, the right to cultivate land in a strip agriculture and pasture their cattle on the village common. This right was bought off by Henry VIII by the payment of a gold coin which, in the rapid inflation of the time due to vast amounts of gold being imported into Europe by the Spaniards from the New World, rapidly became worthless, leaving the serfs to starve or become dependent on charities such as almshouses and later workhouses. Both capitalism and socialism are basically a means of forcing other people to pay for them to have as many kids as they want. Nowadays, having children is most definitely a political act, the most political and in many cases virtually the only political act. In the future technological age, only 90% of the world's population will be, the only thing 90% of the world's population will be able to create is children. By being bombed back to the Stone Age by Tony Blair et al., the Yugoslavian Serbs were forced to cede vast amounts of their territory to the Kosovar Muslims simply because the average family size of the latter is 8. In Northern Ireland, the purely racist IRA has been persuaded to give up its reign of neo-Nazi murder by the promise of a referendum every few years in the well-founded belief that they can outbreed the Protestants. The Irish potato famine of 1846 was always portrayed as caused by the evil British government's refusing to repeal the Corn Laws. In fact, it was caused solely by the fact that in 1800 the population of Ireland was 1 million and in 1845 it was 4 million. Potatoes were the only hope of feeding them all. This was certainly the fault of the British government in failing to enforce population control. But repealing the Corn Laws would simply have exported starvation to the rest of the UK. As it was, many emigrated to North America, where they occupied the territory of the Native Americans and with the greatest hypocrisy give money to NORAID. Where people are starving to death yet the population is increasing, there is not a starvation problem but a population problem. The policy of the Catholic Church is against artificial contraception. Apparently some neurotic saint thought that sex should be used only for the express purpose of procreation. The late lamented poet laureate John Betjeman said that the one thing he regretted in life was not having enough sex. This is by far the better view. The ban on contraceptives is not in the vain hope that it will lead to a reduction in sex, but it will lead to an increase in the production of the next generation for that church. A far greater crime than genocide is having children you can't afford. And this makes the self-styled Pope not only the biggest evil on the planet, but the biggest in history, far worse than Hitler, Idi Amin, Pol Pot and Vlad the Impaler rolled into one. In a country where there was so much water that there was no need to meter it, we are now being told that we must go on a vegetarian diet to accommodate the increasing population. If anyone needs to see the serious danger of this, they need look no further than Hitler or many leaders of the Labour Party. There is not a problem in the world that cannot be ameliorated by a reduction in population and solved in one generation, so long as they don't bring kids into it. Yet we see Victorian parents having vast numbers of children and putting them down into factories and down pits simply to support the parents. Children are seen swarming over the rubbish tips in the so-called developing world, where the only thing developing is the population. Refugee camps swarming with kids dependent solely on the misguided people and countries giving them foreign aid, such as UNICEF and Save the Children Fund. Any improvement in the standard of living is immediately taken up and more by an increase in population. The more money that is raised by these organisations, the more their senior executives get paid. Simply empire building. As a corollary, it can be said that whenever there is a problem, there are always thousands of children. From refugee camps, television advertisements for famine relief in Yemen, slums of Manila, are all characterised by masses of children. Back in the 1960s, my cousin described council housing estates as the breeding grounds of Cheltenham. Jamaica is an example of a so-called poor country. Leaving aside the world's second largest deposit of bauxite, which is a capital asset and thus belongs to future generations in the form of Bitcoin, or at least gold, there is mile upon mile of prime agricultural land surrounded by a sea full of prime fish. This is a rich tropical island that could and should be the next Garden of Eden, apart from the fact that it has to import $1 billion US of food every year rather than export it as it should be doing to pay for its survival. Workhouses existed as charitable institutions as a form of contraception to prevent this from by stopping the parents from having even more children. The primary function of jails is to prevent criminals from having more children, at least while they're inside. There has got to be an end to the two-culture system. The one where you work hard at school, get some sort of trade or profession, get a house to live in and perhaps a car and even a boat, then think about getting married and having a child. The other where parents teach their children to be disruptive in school because they represent authority. The children leave school with no qualifications, expect everybody else to give them a good job with plenty of money, a flat to live in, health care and heaven knows what else. Themselves descended, as Churchill put it, from a long line of maiden aunts to start 2 or 3 families, and by the age of 25 to compete with each other for the title of the youngest grandfather on the block, and to regard this as an achievement. Firstly, children need to be treated in law as the children of their grandparents, etc. This is what's meant by family values. If their parents can't house them, then it's the grandparents' responsibility. This means that the mothers will also get the moral support they obviously need. Moral meaning not having kids until you can afford it. If this results in overcrowding, then it's for the grandparents to move out. There has recently been publicised accounts of the Magdalene homes in Ireland, where unmarried mothers of any age were put in what are workhouses by any other name, and their babies and infants end up in mass graves. In this country they're given council flats. Archaeology has revealed large burials of purely male babies associated with Roman brothels. The supposition is that the female offspring were rapidly put to work, and the males were so numerous that they had no financial value even as bringing up as slaves. Lest it be thought I am biased, this is as much a problem of the aristocracy and the landowners, many of which have inordinately large families. As Bertie Wooster's aunt said to him, "You should be producing children." People buy dogs so they can impose their crap on everybody else by taking them out for the purpose. Having kids is the biggest political act, the ultimate way of imposing yourself on all other people. anywhere in the world, in particular future generations, just like Henry VIII. Children are a divine blessing, not a divine right. They are very expensive in terms of housing, clothing, feeding, educating, providing health care for, setting up in some sort of professional trade, and even providing a dowry for, which in former times was a good means of transferring wealth from one generation to the next, without its being squandered by the older. Children need to be thought of as pure liabilities, luxury goods like caviar and champagne. In times of economic crisis, which are going to increase as the population increases, such as 2008 and COVID, you don't stimulate the economy, GDP, by buying caviar and champagne, which is just a waste of money. Pissing it up against a wall, as a friend of mine rightly put it. You save every penny, turn off every dripping tap and unwanted light bulb. You save this in a bank, and then the bank has money to lend to those with ideas about how to get out of the crisis. If the politicians had any ideas apart from Keynesian economics, which is the exact opposite of democracy, this is what they'd do. In times of economic crisis, government should encourage saving by giving a 10% interest rate on savings, not reduce interest rates to zero or negative. Democracy requires a complete moratorium on having children, the only exception being women over 30 who haven't had one yet. This needs to continue for at least the next 4 generations or so, in the desperate hope that it's not already too late. As the population decreases, there will be fewer people living in tower blocks, having as many children as possible in order to be given a house to live in at everybody else's expense. Tower blocks will gradually be replaced by houses, and then by allotments where people can, like Prince Charles, produce food for themselves. Allotments will give way to small holdings, then farms, then allowed to revert to meadow and woodland. It has recently been stated that the life expectancy of nomadic hunters was 60 or 70, when through overpopulation humans were forced to take up agriculture. This dropped to 20 or 30. Through the diet at best of bread and water, had frequent famines caused by the vagaries of crop disease, climate and so on. The Roundtree Trust was set up by Quakers, a Christian sect, but the only God the modern trust recognises is Marx. According to them, poverty means not being able to buy the essentials for your children, which begs the question of whether you can afford to have children or even a wife in the first place. They define poverty as having households less than 60% of the median income, which begs the question of whether people can afford to move out of the parental home to form their own household in the first place. My parents had to spend the first years of their married life in the front room of my grandparents' house, after the bomb damage had been repaired. Is that a separate household? The measure of wealth has to be solely the number of children you have. All children are treated exactly equally, particularly in terms of the education which is their birthright. Deprivation is a term often heard. Nobody in this country, at least, is being deprived of anything, with the possible exception of children, and certainly not by me. There was a general idea that by procreating you are doing the world a favour. Overpopulation is the greatest form of pollution and by far the biggest contributor to global warming. In former times, many men would have joined the army and retired to boarding houses in Eastbourne. Women would have been housemaids or nannies, not allowed followers, spending their lives looking after other people's children. Rather like that excellent film The Remains of the Day, they would never dream of having kids of their own. Thus, granting the right for each woman to have a child should be seen as a derogation from democracy. There's a culture somewhere in North Africa where all the women start off as sex workers. When they think they have saved up enough money, they buy the most expensive husband they can afford. There is an argument for making this part of the National Health Service, and is certainly better than lager lout holidays in Benidorm, with the risk of AIDS, VD and so on. There's no better way to meet a husband, and most parents would want their sons to marry professional women. In the age of rising technology, there will be fewer unskilled jobs about. There will be less work of any kind about, so people will have to rely on the national dividend. The idle rich and the idle poor will meet in the middle, leaving only such of the middle class as remain to do all the work. No doubt, referring to himself, Oscar Wilde said, "Work is the curse of the drinking classes." Here then is the primary duty of politics, to determine how big the population will be, and until this target is achieved, it must take priority over asylum applications, and such treaties need to be amended accordingly. If it is determined by the politicians that a car, colour TV and a holiday in Spain are everybody's birthright, then population will necessarily be lower than otherwise. It comes down to the choice of a child or a car. There are also strategic considerations. In two world wars, defeat was only weeks away because, owing to submarines, enough food to sustain the population could not be imported. Nowadays, now that the UK is no longer part of the EU, strategic reliance cannot be placed on any food supplies from it. If, as is very likely, Scotland becomes independent and joins the EU, if England is faced by starvation on the streets, no reliance can be placed on food parcels being sent down from Scotland like barrels being sent to Jamaica. They would simply stand there and laugh. The largest producer of rice, India, has banned the export of rice, preferring to let it rot in their warehouses rather than feed the starving babies of Africa. This leaves only North America as the major exporter of grain. There are thus democratic limits on population size, and these can vary over time. Between these limits is the province of politics. When people currently vote in elections, it's very invariably for the party who will give them the biggest short-term financial gain. In democracy, it's for the political parties it's for the political party you think will give the best balance between population size and affluence. It is generally supposed that the population control can only be exercised by totalitarian states such as China, such as the problem with the Uyghurs, but it is the primary function of democracy. No other country is even prepared to acknowledge it has a population problem. Thus China is the most democratic country on the planet, with the highest regard for human rights, particularly those of generations yet unborn. The solution to global warming is for each country to reduce its population until it achieves net zero in carbon production. At the moment, it's impossible to get them to produce net zero even in population growth. What we need is not a Paris Climate Accord, but a Paris Population Accord. On the face of it, it is obviously more desirable to give the right to have a child to women rather than men. But this will lead to such as Bin Laden, who was the 17th child of 63 to the same father. But if a woman has two children, the only option is to put her in jail, which is obviously undesirable for the children. If the right is granted to men, then it will mean many women without any children at all. Men who have more than one child could spend the rest of their lives in jail, which need not be unpleasant places, but living rather like lay brothers in monasteries. They could be allowed out only under the strictest of controls. It means submitting to blackmail, but the only other solution is to pay women not as at present to have kids, but not to have kids while there's still time and money enough to do so. With a life expectancy rapidly approaching 80, even at one child per woman, it's going to take nearly a century to reduce the population by a half. Back to the level it was as recently as 1930. If work was such a good thing, the rich would save it all for themselves. The socialist John Lennon said he would never work again, thereby depriving us, as he would see it, of the benefit of his labours. I have never heard of a millionaire taking a job as a supermarket shelf filler, just so he can say he's being socially useful. In a democracy, job seekers' allowance and indeed all other benefits will be replaced by the national dividend, leaving income and other taxes to provide for the defence of democracy at home and abroad. In other words, military expenditure and law enforcement at home, the executive and judicial functions of the state. As I have shown in my book Democracy, Theory and Practice, published by the World Law Centre, the military is merely enforcing international law, so this is one and the same thing. Except in wartime, there is no obligation to take a job. Those registered as unemployed are not short of a job, they are short of money. The unemployment figures are thus false, as they, number one, do not include those who are currently living off investments. It includes those who would otherwise be perfectly happy to live off the national dividend. With these provisos, the unemployment figures are simply the overpopulation figures. Until democracy is achieved worldwide, in other words, while nation-states still exist, the principal duty of the local heads of state is to keep their populations in. Failure to do so is as much a crime against democracy as is making a military invasion. Examples are at the present time include Mexico and France among the many. As coruscatingly put by the greatest economist and politician of recent times, Jane Austen, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The good fortune has to come first. The wife, or wives and kids, have to come after, not as Keynes would have it, the other way round.